Thank you. Thank you for that welcome and invitation to this. It's an honour to be here, even virtually. I'm going to start, I'll show my screen, hopefully this works. Does that work? Let me know. I think that works, yes, okay. So I'm going to start slightly paradoxically, given the session is about politics of climate change, and that's what my work has been about, by a sort of asking the question through this image, really, and using this image to explore that, about why actually lots of actors, politicians, corporate leaders, lots of even NGOs, have reasons to think, to present us as if climate change is not a political issue. Right? And this, I'm sure Ovais Samed was there as well. This image that you see before me was a car that was in the concourse of COP26 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow, just over a year and a bit ago. And this car was something that anybody who was there passed several times a day. It was right outside the main sort of business fair part of the COP. It was on the concourse between all the many of the meeting rooms, and it was sort of completely unavoidable. And so this car proudly proclaimed to be the first electric car capable of operating in a Formula One race. It proclaimed that, so it worked so that lovers of racing of fast cars who are nevertheless worried about climate change could breathe a sigh of relief. Oh, that's great, we can have our racing cars and still address climate change. Those of us who don't care about racing fast cars could roll our eyes, but at least think that one obstacle to acting on climate change might have been overcome. But fundamentally what this image represents is that lots of us have a really powerful instinct to pretend that climate change is not political. It tells us that everything can change while nothing changes. We can radically transform societies to take all of the carbon out, take the fossil fuels out, but still have all of the things that we currently have, all the way up to Formula One racing. It tells us that there's no climate-related challenge that can't be solved with technological innovation. It tells us, as you can see, and you might be able to see, I think your image might be quite small on the screen, but anyway, just behind the car, there's a logo which says "Together for Our Planet" with a picture of the Earth, and that was the UK government's, the host government, slogan for COP, or one of its slogans for COP26, and that's reproduced behind the car. It tells us that we're all in this together. It tells us that there aren't really fundamental conflicts of interest or power to be addressed. And it tells us also that many of the most powerful actors in the world, in this case the car manufacturers, are all on board with transforming the world to meet the climate challenge. The hint at the lie behind this powerful belief is in the top right of the image. At one level, this is pure dumb luck because I took this photograph and it happened to be saying food shortages. This was actually, that's actually a video screen, and it happened to be, and that was the still I happened to take. There we have a still from the plane behind the car. This gives us the sense that behind the technological optimism and the "together for our planet" rhetoric, there might actually be thorny dilemmas and conflicts integral to dealing with climate change. In particular, large swathes of humanity remain much closer to the world of food shortages than they ever will be to the world of Formula One racing. And the jarring image there thus tells us a lot about whose interests and visions for the future are represented in the concourse of COP26. Your sort of dominant image of this technological innovation by large companies, and then a slightly minor image about food shortages and worries about the climate future. So the impulse for Formula One electric cars being common throughout the history of climate change, this impulse to say there is no politics, it's all about technology, etc., etc. But it has always been accompanied by other palpably political dynamics that have shaped the global response. And I should perhaps start by saying what I mean by the word political, because it's not a word that has a universally accepted single meaning, even if we rest within one language, English. If we move to others, it gets more complicated still. But I think of it in three interconnected ways. So firstly, politics is about those collective authoritative decision-making processes that any large-scale social enterprise has to have, right? we usually use the words and the sites and institutions that develop to make those decisions, right? We usually use the word the state as a shorthand for this. Secondly, it's about the question of power. Who has power? Where do they get it from? How are those power relations structured? How is power exercised and with what effects? And thirdly,
Dr. Paterson, I'm so sorry to interrupt. However, your slides have frozen.
I haven't moved the slides on. Don't worry. Yeah, don't worry. In a minute, they will move, and then I'll tell you. Then we'll see. And thirdly, it entails recognizing that any society, both within societies and, of course, globally, has conflicts within it which are integral and can't be just resolved and pretended that they don't exist. Often they're intertwined with these power relations, and then the state has a sort of job. One of its jobs is to deal with these social conflicts and the power inequalities. Now we'll see if the slide moving works. So the first of these then, if we come back to climate change, that has driven climate politics forward over the last 30 plus years that climate has been on the political agenda, is the question of inequalities. These are within societies, but also across them. And they're also both about the inequalities in greenhouse gas emissions, but also in climate change impacts. I'm going to focus more on the former, but of course they intertwine in the sense that high emitting parts of the world, whether that's countries or groups of people, are often relatively less vulnerable, while low emitting parts of the world are more vulnerable to climate change impacts. That's a gross generalization, but nevertheless. Emissions themselves are highly unequal across the world, with emissions from a country like Bhutan at still around 1.5 tonnes per capita, and in fact already net zero because of the extent of forest cover in the country, while a country's emissions in a country like Qatar are 35 tonnes per capita. So you've got huge inequalities of emissions. And history also matters here, because climate emissions are what we call a stock problem, right? It's the accumulation of the gases in the atmosphere over time, not a flow problem, right? Not just the emissions in any given year that might be lower next year. So while a country like the UK is now at about 5 tonnes per capita, having seen the biggest decline of all industrialized countries over the last 30 years, it of course has a massive legacy of coal-fueled industrialization longer than any other country, and of course closely connected to colonial exploitation globally. So the UK is actually much more important in having caused climate change than you would get the sense of if you just looked at this year's emissions. The instinct then to pretend climate change is not political led to a conflict encapsulated in this cartoon. The Washington-based World Resources Institute produces an annual report compiling all sorts of data and analyses about environmental degradation. And in 1990-91, they included greenhouse gas emissions for the first time. But they presented these as just total emissions, not including per capita data. And what happened then was that the list of top emitting countries was, in 1990, the USA, USSR, still existed at that point, Brazil, China, and India. So 3 of the 5 top emitters were developing countries in that way of calculating it. Unsurprisingly, this drew a furious reaction. And this cartoon circulated at the time very widely amongst climate NGOs and so on. And the Delhi-based think tank, the Centre for Science and Environment, produced a report attacking the World Resources Institute called Climate Change in an Unequal World, a Case of Environmental Colonialism. And they put this cartoon on the front cover to encapsulate what was going on. It explains the key arguments well, that per capita emissions matter. It matters that you've got somebody driving a gas guzzling car versus somebody just cutting down a tree for fuel wood or whatever. And it also matters that encapsulating survival emissions to meet basic needs with luxury emissions, driving a big car, is unreasonable. So these inequalities of power and wealth are thus central to dealing with climate change. Lots of the politics of climate change at the international level has thus been driven by the question of inequalities in emissions. Early on, it drove debates about how to distribute emissions reductions in the context of this inequality. And so this produced the language of common but differentiated responsibilities, which pervades the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change now, and lots of our thinking about how we should move forward. But that was the result of the negotiations in 1991 to 2, which produced the UN Framework Convention in the first place. And it's therefore served as this normative guide, structuring the future negotiations, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and so on. Itself, it was already a fudge. In those negotiations, there was a harder line, for example, from Indian and Chinese negotiators that low-emitting developing countries, any with emissions under about 2 tons per capita, had basically no responsibility to address their emissions at all. Those inequalities and how they were negotiated then produced also the key institutional elements in the Kyoto Protocol, the clean development mechanism. So developing countries successfully argued at COP1 in Berlin in 1995 that this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities implied that developing countries would have no emissions targets in the protocol being negotiated. But industrialized countries and negotiators, and in particular in the US, argued that without affecting developing country emissions, action by rich countries would be useless. And the CDM was a result with this, enabling industrialized countries to invest in emissions reductions in the global south and count those reductions against their own obligations. And we have the echo of this in the Paris Agreement, a similar sort of institution, although the underlying design of Paris is very different, of course. Since then, though, since 1990, one of the things about inequalities is it has changed quite significantly in that 30-year period, right? The inequalities in emissions continue to structure those conflicts in the negotiations, but the situations become much more complex. And this this figure is from the last IPCC report in 2022. So, for example, as we've seen, UK emissions have declined dramatically, 47% since 1990. And most European countries have experienced this sort of decline in emissions, not from modest to significant, as has the United States. But other industrialized countries have had stable but not declining emissions, Canada and Japan, for example. But emissions from most developing countries, not everywhere, but most developing countries have risen rapidly, and now in many cases are higher than many in the global north. China's per capita emissions now are about 50% higher than the UK's, for example, and South Korea's over twice as high on a per capita basis. The historical point I made still applies, of course. This makes the politics of dealing with these inequalities more complicated and has contributed to the collapse of a strict north-south divide in the way that the Paris Agreement is structured quite differently. There's still the underlying principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, but it's not really reflected in the Paris Agreement in the same way as it was previously. The second aspect of politics of climate change I wanted to pick up on, though, is whether rich or poor, pretty much all states are driven by an obsession with growth. Economic growth. Even pioneer states like Bhutan, in resisting the focus on GDP as a measure of national progress, don't avoid this perfectly. But almost everywhere else, the definition of value and progress, and thus of a crisis, is in terms of economic growth. For most of us in the social sciences, it is not really that the obsession with growth is because of a desire to make people better. Indeed, many dynamics of growth clearly make people's lives worse, working ever harder, dispossessed from their land, for example. It is rather that societies have an inbuilt set of structures that generate growth, markets, labour relations, technological innovation, and so on. But they do so very unequally and very unstably. It is dressed up usually about improving people's lives through, for example, the narrative of development, but that's not actually what drives it. And this growth obsession became first established in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In climate change, we are very much living still in the shadow of this particular history. That major transformation is the ultimate cause of climate change because it was fundamentally driven by fossil fuels, as the figure now shows. And in particular, early on, by coal. The black line there, you can see through to about 1950, it's 80% of the sources of energy in the global economy. And so the expansion first of coal, then oil, then natural gas have been at the heart of enabling the rapid expansion of industry, transport systems that are the cause of CO2 emissions. They also enabled an accelerated land clearance for agriculture. And finally, it was also the origin of lots of the extent of those inequalities in income and emissions we've seen. As a result, almost everywhere, the dominant assumption has been that pursuing growth without expanding fossil fuels is basically impossible. And in that context, climate change becomes a really difficult problem, and lots of effort has gone in to work out exactly how can we decouple growth from fossil energy use. But the growth process of the last 200 years has also meant that because fossil fuels have been so crucial to that growth, the companies that have deployed and controlled those energy sources have become tremendously powerful. In some countries, this is of course so clear that working out where the oil industry stops and the state starts is more or less impossible. But even in countries where fossil energy industries are just one amongst many, they still have particularly strong power with exceptionally strong links to politicians across all countries. This power has been one of the most important blocks to action on climate change. Companies have lobbied fiercely against climate action, and they've used various strategies promoting climate denial, emphasizing scientific uncertainties, and so on, to support that lobbying. They've also, at the international level, worked very closely with major oil exporting states, in particular Saudi Arabia, to undermine climate action within the FCCC. There are, of course, chinks. Coal, in particular, is in decline in lots of places. The decline in UK emissions is very largely about the collapse of coal from about 65% of electricity generation to basically zero now. And there is a coalition in the UNFCCC process led by the UK and Canada called the Paro and Pass Coal Alliance, sort of signing people up and persuading countries that actually eliminating coal is a very quick fix and easy to do technically, lots of other benefits in terms of air quality and health and so on. So there are sounds of that movement, but really only in coal, much less so in relation to oil and natural gas. So it remains, I think, that we can't deal with climate change without dealing with these thorny problems, the inequalities in emissions, as well as the impacts that are pervasive and complex, the imperative of growth and the power of those that are central to that growth process, notably the big energy companies. Campaigning and political struggle by movements and NGOs are integral to climate change, whether through the notion of climate justice or through opposition to these fossil fuel companies and their power. Governments are often caught up in the middle of these struggles, wanting to please both sides, but are usually bound up with the companies quite deeply. And that's one of the reasons then why they continue to favour the option represented by the Formula One electric car, which again comes back to pretending that it's not political, but actually then showing that it's those power relations really structure why it is we end up seeing this sort of development structuring climate change. I will stop there and thank you and welcome your questions.